Evening, everybody. My name is Will McMahon, and I'd like to welcome you to this Talking About Socialism from a Marxist Point of View meeting. This evening's meeting is going to be about Yemen towards the abyss. Before we get onto that, I just want to point you in the direction of the future meetings we have, the next three we have on our agenda. On 5th February, we've got How Has the Broad Left Project Die Linke fared in Germany? And I'm sure all of you will have been watching the events in Germany over the last 48 hours at least, to give it particularly added context, with the demonstrations of the left against the AfD. On the 19th of February, we've got war in Ukraine 2 years on. Russia invaded Ukraine on 22nd of February 2022. Reaction to the war was divided amongst the left internationally. What should Marxists say? And you'll have the pleasure of me introducing on that one. And on the 4th of March, we've got what should socialists, communists do in the 2024 general election? That was the meeting we were going to have this evening, but we thought the events in the Middle East, in particular around Yemen, took priority. In particular, I mean, people may have heard the news today that a couple of Navy SEALs appear to have been killed in action in Yemen in some way or other, and this is now on international news. So we like to have a comradely debate talking about socialism, and we like to have a fair exchange of points of view and disagreements where disagreements are, but we always like to keep the debate comradely. One way of doing this is to allow each person 3 minutes to speak, and you get a second and third go if time allows, but we try and keep contributions to 3 minutes, except of course for the person introducing, who gets 15 minutes and some time at the end to sum up. We will finish at 9. We won't go past 9 p.m. We may finish a little early before that. It depends how the conversation goes. And I need to tell you that this is a public event. So it'll be going up on YouTube, so bear that in mind when you are thinking about what you're going to say. Also, we've got a website which we'd like you to visit. Please comment on the articles. If you want to write an article, come forward and make a suggestion about the article that you'd like to write. The next one we've got going up, I think, is going to be on housing and a housing victory in Southwark by Gary Osterlenk, which is a really interesting article because we're just subbing it now to go on the website. So get involved, visit the website, put these meetings in your diary. So to return to tonight's event, we have Chris Strafford, who is going to be talking for 15 minutes on Yemen towards the abyss. So I'm going to hand over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Will. Hello, evening, comrades. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, starting off with Yemen and strikes against the Houthis and some of the things that have led on from that and led up to that even. We've seen, obviously, over the last couple of weeks, the Americans, along with Britain, and actually joined by other countries, have either intercepted military targets heading out of Yemen or have now taken up aggressive strikes against Houthi positions, their missile bases and garrisons and what have you, which are essentially reprisal strikes for the Houthis getting involved in the war that is taking place in the Gaza Strip and across the region of the Levant, and where Israel is carrying out a genocidal campaign against the Palestinian Arabs, as we have seen on our television screens night after night since the middle of October. Where I want to start is actually in 2015, which is not really the very start of this story, but the start that we're going to take. And that is with the Saudi-led but Western-armed coalition taking action against the Houthis in Yemen. Through their air power and their missile strikes, they managed to reduce large areas of Yemen to what can only really be described as a choleric rubble, with millions struggling to feed themselves, subject to diseases. If we take the United Nations numbers, some 377,000 people were killed either directly or indirectly because of the military action taken by Saudi and its allies. For some kind of comparison in the numerical terms, that would be like witnessing a city like Coventry disappearing off the maps, or proportionally Birmingham. You'd be there, over 9 years, seeing those populations bombed and starved to death. But the Saudis have essentially lost that war. The internationally recognized government is held up in Aden, supported by the West, supported by Saudi, but exerts very little control over the population and the the entirety of Yemen. So with all that air power, with all the Western weapons, with the mercenary armies that Saudi raised and sent to die, the Saudis lost that war. So these airstrikes carried out by the Americans and by our own air force, are unlikely to deter the Houthi militia from carrying out any further military strikes against shipping or against Israel. In fact, what the strikes have done is made shipping less safe in the region, as we saw with a near miss on a Russian container ship only last week. Well, the Houthis are an anti-Saudi nationalist populist movement, really, from the north of Yemen. There's a long history there, which we won't be able to go into straight away. But fundamentally, their movement is to improve Shia representation in Yemen, to reinstate the Zaydi imamate, eventually to return to Sharia. But to be clear, neither of those have happened yet in the regions which the Houthis control. And that is part of their ideology. And this brings us to the question of why the Houthis have intervened. Why have they taken action? There's a great lie that is going around the TV stations and in our papers that the action of the Houthis have nothing to do with the war that is being waged against the people of Gaza. David Cameron swinishly gets up on TV and tells us that every time that missile strikes and commando raids on shipping by the Houthi forces, are not to do with Gaza. So Britain constantly echoes what the Biden administration is saying. And of course, the very loyal Keir Starmer and the rest of the Labour front bench go along with that as well. But we know this is a lie. And it's one of many lies that is doing the rounds at the moment. The Houthis are generally a reactionary movement, and they may have taken the opportunity to distract Yemenis from the situation within Yemen, where people are still starving, people without basic services. Before the war in Gaza, there were popular protests against the Houthi forces. The Houthis have a clear goal, and that is halting the ethnic cleansing that is taking place in the Gaza Strip, and for the opening of the borders to allow medicine and food to enter to the besieged population. The Yemeni people, who have suffered years and years of bombardment and blockade, know too well what the people of Gaza are currently living through. There is a stench of anti-Semitism from Houthi leaders. Their slogans, their ideology, their sermons certainly take on an anti-Semitic character. There's also the link to Iran and the Revolutionary Guards. But these troops are not what is galvanizing the millions of people across the region behind the Houthis. It's not what is galvanizing the people of Yemen behind the Houthis. It is their action against the West and against Israel in defense of the people of Gaza. And what the Houthis have achieved is that they have managed to slow down and in part choke off the Gulf of Suez. Massive companies such as Maersk, BP, and what have you, are all having to sail the long way around the Cape of Good Hope. It takes us about 10 days more than it would do going through the Suez Canal. And that's going to push up prices, everything from food to white goods to, petrol at the petrol pumps, basically. About 12% of global trade and 30% of container traffic goes through that region. And the effects have already been made. Tesla had to cease production temporarily in Berlin. Next, obviously, has warned that some of its clothes will not be available because they're stuck on container ships going around Cape of Good Hope. But the danger of war for the shipping companies actually turned out quite well, for now at least anyway, as their profits have gone up and Maersk's shares have already gone up by a quarter, I believe, just in the last month. What we see from Britain and from America and from the other Western powers is that profits matter way more than the lives of the Palestinians or any other population in the region. What we have, we can listen to the squeals from the US and European leaders, including our own, about national sovereignty and international law and the rest of it. But you can also listen out for the absolute silence from when it's going the other way. The United States acting with, no restraints, can do whatever it wants in whatever country, regardless of whatever talk of international law and sovereignty. And that goes also for Israel and what they're currently doing in the Gaza Strip. We can see that the crocodile tears from some of the Western leaders and what have you matter little, because what they're still doing is arming the Israeli Defense Forces, servicing the fighter jets that are bombing the population of Gaza. For us as communists, we know that squeezing profits and disrupting capital is the surest way to make the capitalists make their own governments get up and act, and that's exactly what has happened. It's just a shame that it's being done by the Houthis and not the working class of Egypt and the wider region. And the apparent goal of the United States and of Britain is allegedly to be prevent an extension of the conflict in Gaza, with the strikes in Yemen, the boarding of Iranian-flagged vessels, and their actions in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon actually tell a different story. They're widening the conflict because Iran is the real target here with what Britain and America are up to. Iran is an independent military power at the heart of one of the most economically crucial regions of the world. We all know, we've all heard the beat of drums, war drums against Iran for the last decade, if not more. There's no accident here that, every time Houthis or Hezbollah or Islamic resistance in Syria or Iraq are mentioned, the finger gets pointed at Tehran. We know that Tehran has allies and proxies in the region. But what this is about is we as a public in the West, in Britain, were being boiled like frogs, being prepared for aggressive strikes against Iran, no doubt to be sold to us as defensive actions. That is what we're being softened up for. And such a disaster, should that happen, should we spiral into that situation, would be catastrophic not just for the world economy, but for the working class in the region and across the world. The Strait of Hormuz would probably be closed. Oil, petrol prices would rocket. In the United States, we're in an election year. Donald Trump could basically put his feet up because he will walk into the White House in such a situation where the already declining living standards of the American working class decline further. The key victims of this war obviously lie in Gaza and Yemen and the wider region, directly through slaughter, through starvation, through disease, but also across the world. It would be the working class that is going to have to pay the price for this war and for the spiral towards greater wars. We see Europe rearming, generals from Sweden to London to Berlin getting extremely excited about getting more and more war funding, more and more tanks. more and more of our working class young people to be sent off to their deaths? Should we go to war with Russia or China or in the further wars in the Middle East? So for communists, for us as communists, and then for all of these wars, and we understand that capitalism breeds these wars, and we could talk about that more in the discussion. We are against the growing rearming taking place across the West. And in place of endless war, in place of the sectarian and ethnic massacres that have taken place in the region against the dictatorship, against settler colonialism, the only long-term solution in the region is for a socialist revolution. It's for the oppressed peoples and for the working class across the Levant, across the Arabian Peninsula and the wider region to shake off tyrants, whether they're in Ankara, Sana'a, Tehran, Jerusalem. None of these leaders offer a solution for the working class or for the people of the Middle East. But we do have some tasks here at home. We've seen an impressive anti-war movement return to the streets. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people marching almost on a weekly basis to bring this war to an end. And that, while significant and important and, should be celebrated, it can't halt the shipments of arms. It's not putting a spanner in the works. What is needed is more working class action. We've seen trade union pickets and activist actions outside of arms factories, outside of docks and what have you. So we need to expand and campaign for the shipment of arms, the production of arms to be halted so that no more weapons get to the hands of the warmongers. But above all, one of the clearest way for us to assure that this war does not spiral or further wars do not spiral, that we do not end up in another great war only a few years down the road, is to get rid of the warmongers here at home. And that means building an alternative, a communist alternative, which for us, which we've spoken about previously, is a communist party that challenges the narratives of the British state here in the here and now, stands up against their war goals, defies their militarism, appeals to the young workers that are in our armed forces not to follow what their commanders and their officers say. But ultimately, it is about getting rid of the British state, its standing army, the monarchy and the rest of it. Because only then, once we've overthrown the capitalists here and across Europe and the wider world, we see an end to the system that brings about constant war and turmoil, not just to the people of Gaza and Yemen, but to the people of Ukraine and with the workers the world over. Thank you, Will.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks for that, Chris. Okay, so we have contributions of 3 minutes now from anybody who would like to speak. There was a lot in what Chris said. So do pick out anything from his introduction that you want to contribute on. We've got plenty of time. Our first hand is up and it's Minnie.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Thank you for the talk, Chris. And I tell you what, I totally agree with you. Profit matters more than the Palestinians, and that sums it up. There've been some retired colonels, US colonels, that I've been listening to on YouTube. One of them thinks that they're bombing the Houthis to obfuscate, to take the attention off what's going on in Gaza. Obviously, I think they're doing it just to demonstrate their power, because that's what they do. Also, these two colonels, and there's a general involved as well, so they count the decisions being made about funding Ukraine and Gaza, the Gaza wars, as crazy. there's an election year, and Biden, for example, funding Ukraine, doesn't want to be seen to lose Ukraine until the elections are over. So yeah, they're going for the same targets in Yemen as they went for with the Saudi proxies. The US and UK did a lot of work on that. They provided engineering and stuff and guiding some of the jets and all sorts of things. So they're going for some of the same targets. Now the Houthis are stronger than ever. I don't, and thanks for what you said. I don't know much about them. I don't know much about the Houthis, but I heard people saying that they've had a kind of revolution and they're sort of de facto government, really. Yeah. Right. I know Max Blumenthal from the Grey Zone has interviewed a Houthi representative. I don't know if it's up on YouTube yet. It wasn't yesterday, but I'm looking forward to listening to that. And they're currently putting out information about the Israelis, Israeli military putting TikTok videos like comedy or faux satire, and joyfulness in murder and destruction of buildings and infrastructure. It's quite shocking. So, yeah, and one US politician pointed to the demos. I've heard someone else say this, that there's mass demos going across all over the world. And particularly, he's pointing to the demos in the West, and he's saying, oh, look at these demos. That shows us that multiculturalism doesn't work. When in actual fact, it shows the opposite. It shows that people are standing together. And it's fantastic. To oppose mass slaughter, demand peace. Coalitions are being built across religions and race, nationalities. Campaigns are being built. There's a young Jewish historian called Barnaby Rain, I think his name is, and he asserts the growing realization that we're not free until we're all free. Surely that's what communism is. Am I finished?
I'm going to have to finish you there.
Okay, I'll come back maybe.
It was a good sentence to finish on, though.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome to come back on and continue that one. Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Minnie. I think that was really good, and thanks for the introduction. I think the first thing to say is that actually there's been a couple of opinion polls done in Britain on this. Well, more than a few, but the interesting ones actually show that there's a consistent over 70% of people in Britain want a ceasefire now. Now you'd never guess that from our politicians, would you? Really? So in those terms, I think that the core driver here actually, of course, is the crisis within Israeli politics, and the fact that the thing itself is falling apart, and therefore, of course, you stage a war in order to try and hold it together, and a genocidal war at that. That, of course, then backed up by imperialism. And this is a key thing, of course, is the functioning of imperialism. And of course, what you're looking at is Biden actually then, of course, supports Netanyahu. Obviously, now all the Americans are looking to get rid of Netanyahu. They're obviously floating the idea that they should get rid of him because he's too difficult to deal with and he's embarrassing to them. On the 8th of October, Biden phoned Netanyahu and agreed to give him everything he wanted in terms of military gear, and that by the 6th of December, they'd supplied in excess of 10,000 tons of gear, including many thousands of bombs, shells, etc., etc. I mean, virtually everything that's being fired out or dropped on Gaza comes from the US. It can almost be looked at as a US operation in those terms. And actually, the US has first refusal, has a veto power on the Israeli military because it actually supports it to that degree. So it's effectively an extension of the imperialists. So obviously, the Israelis have their own political interests and so on. I think that the interesting thing about the Houthis, of course, is that obviously it's a tribal revolt against the very corrupt government of Yemen, but it actually intersects quite strong as a Shia movement. It actually intersects with the Iranian, but more strongly actually with Hezbollah. it actually takes from Hezbollah, and they actually have discussions with Hezbollah over some time. So you can see the parallel, between the two. The other thing, the interesting thing about what's going on in the Red Sea, of course, is this intersection between the ability, the new forms of military technology, i.e. drones and missiles and so on, which are dirt cheap, and which allow you to attack all sorts of things, many very expensive things as well. And of course, the insurance companies. And the key point is that you've had a drop of over 2/3 in December last month. You've had a drop of over 2/3 of container traffic, which is critical in world terms, through the Red Sea. But basically, because by the middle of the month, the insurance companies turn around to all the shipping companies. So unless you pay us vast amounts of money, we're not going to insure your ships. And effectively, it's that intersection between the crisis of finance capital and the military crisis has basically choked it off. It's incredible as a thing. The other thing, of course, is interesting. Yeah. Okay. One more sentence is the protest did last week in Cyprus against the use of the British use of imperial bases, which of course the colonial bases in Cyprus, to bomb Yemen. It's moving across the whole region. Thanks.
It is. It's very interesting watching how this is unpacking. Ed.
Thanks, Will, and thanks to Chris for the great introduction. I'm going to pick up sort of where Matthew left off in terms of protest and reaction to this operation in the countries that are involved in it, in the predominantly Western countries that are involved in this military operation, because it is simply an operation on the face of it. It's not a joint operation by, for instance, NATO or the EU. It's another coalition of the willing. And one of the interesting things about it is that apparently there are up to 20 countries which are supporting this military operation, which is, of course, led by the Americans and to a lesser extent the UK. So there are 20 countries supporting it, but only 10 or 11 of those have made their involvement public. So there's another 9 or 10 who are supporting this military operation, but who won't disclose that they are, and their names have not been made public. And I think that probably tells us something quite interesting about what the assessment of the ruling class is in terms of whether they would actually be able to gain the consent of their domestic populations for involvement in this, because it's quite a nuanced thing, operations like this, because of course it's not full-blown war of the type which you would expect to see Britain or America committing troops on the ground, although undoubtedly there will be special forces there covertly, but not in large numbers. And so for a lot of people, this will simply sail under the radar. A lot of people in the general population probably aren't even aware that we're involved in this operation, this small-scale war. And I think that is something that we need to think about in terms of how we advance the arguments and how we publicize what's going on and campaign against it. Because, of course, part of our role will inevitably be to tell people for the first time. It'll be the first they're hearing of it, really, or the first time they fully grasp what's going on. It's not something that's in all the headlines and is an inescapable fact. So I think we need to bear that in mind. Yeah, no, I'm going to leave it there. I'll come back later in the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Ed. You were 15 seconds early. Janet.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was really useful, succinct introduction, which I agreed with, I guess. I don't know that much about it. And about the future, although, if you're in Gaza at the moment, the future and the revolution must seem a very long way off. But I just wanted to ask, I suppose, Chris, some questions. Really about the position of Biden's administration the US, because it seems to me there are huge contradictions in what they're doing, what their interests are, and what they're saying. And I don't know if you kind of referred to this in a way when you were talking about, you know, if this gets into a much wider than it is now, and if it starts involving Iran, well, let's say goodbye if it starts involving Iran. But it's absolutely electorally disastrous for Biden, and we can already see that it's doing him no good, just their unconditional support for Israel. And that support, clearly, they can't remove. If they can't remove the arms sales, they will have to give them unconditional support. And how do they reconcile that with, clearly, I don't think they want that wider, at the moment, they don't want, I mean, the administration, I'm not talking about people behind them or the arms manufacturers or whatever, they can't want to get into that wider conflict. So how do they, you know, how will they proceed in that? Because it seems to me they're in a totally impossible position, whilst the only thing that would stop any of this in terms of being able to stop what's happening in the Red Sea is a ceasefire, and that's not, yet Netanyahu seems to be saying to Biden, get stuffed, actually. Maybe looking towards Trump, I don't know. So I think it's just about how do you feel those contradictions, those tensions can be, I'm asking you to be Biden, which is obviously crazy, but what do they mean, actually? How is this going to evolve over the next month, over the next 3 months, or whatever? That's it.
Thanks very much, Jana. Okay, we've got time for the list is empty now. So if you want to put your hand up, and I would encourage everybody maybe to ask a question, make a contribution. There is no such thing as a daft question. Questions always bring really, really interesting answers, I think. So put your hand up. Let me have a look who we've got. Okay, I am going to hold a little bit to see if Ian or John Henry or Julie, Michael, Saray or Richard or Nick actually. It's a second. I'm really sorry. I thought it was Minnie again. You've got your hand up. Come in.
Okay, I'll try and keep this short. What I find confusing is, in terms of Israel, the talk of campaigning for a ceasefire, because the way I see the way Israel is behaving, they are behaving like the Nazis. And in the Second World War, we wouldn't have defeated the Nazis by calling for a ceasefire. And that I think is the difficulty that you're facing. It's an absolute war that's being carried out. It's not difference of opinion where we can just campaign and, oh well, if we win the argument, that's it. No, I think it's a class war, and I think it needs to be treated, you know, in a stronger, more forceful way. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I'd like to put my hand up again, but so my hand's up, so I'll mute for now. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much to Chris for the excellent introduction. For me, the developments in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, now extending to Yemen, and the exchange of missiles between Iran and Pakistan, the killing of military personnel in Iraq, and so on, really do raise the prospect of the widening of the conflict in the Middle East. I mean, I was doing a little bit of reading for the meeting this evening, and Chris has given a figure that I'd seen: 370,000 dead in the Yemen in the bombardment by the Saudi government against the people of Yemen. And I would think that very few people in Britain or elsewhere in the world, apart from perhaps the Arab world, will be aware of anything like that. And it's astonishing, isn't it, that 1/3 million people can disappear as the result of a tyrannical bombardment without very much protest. And in one sense, what's happened with the Houthis, although we might have, or probably, well, do have profound disagreements with the ideology of the leadership of the Houthis, their bombardment of the shipping and the attack on transport and affecting the profits has brought home what's been going on. And it really gives a lie, doesn't it, to the idea that somehow what we're heading to, or what we've seen in Ukraine, what we're going to see in battles with Iran or further conflict with Russia, wherever it might be, leading up to a conflict with China, is somehow a battle of democracy against autocracy. And yet America has financed Saudi Arabia, provided it with the arms, financed Israel, provided it with the arms to carry out the brutal bombardments that both of those countries have carried out. It's nothing to do with democracy, and it's nothing to do with autocracy. It's about which nation and which block of nations is going to be top dog on the world carve-up of the globe. What's lacking, I find, in a lot of the discussion, in fact, most of the discussion on the left, I'll come back to this point if I've got time later, is the question of what the working class does.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much for that. Kept to time. Matthew?
Yeah, okay, just say a few things. In terms of, the thing is, in terms of Israel, I mean, what we're looking at is the collapse of the basis of Israeli society and politics. I mean, what we're looking, if previous to this war, obviously you saw this enormous campaign against Netanyahu and so on, which is obviously within the Jewish community itself. But is an immense split. I mean, the problem really was then, the question that was obviously posed was, well, obviously you can't have democracy in which you occupy and refuse to deal with, millions of people, which is what's the situation in Gaza and the West Bank. And therefore you can't, it's bizarre and crazy. And people did actually try to put that. Obviously, there were even violence on the demonstrations against Netanyahu, in which people were raising the questions. Well, you have to deal with the occupation, as and it's not just a question of preserving the Israeli Supreme Court and all the rest of it. But the thing is actually falling apart, and this effort by Netanyahu is an effort to try and preserve Israeli society by means of war, which will fail. I mean, this is the problem we've got, is that the position will fail. In terms of the imperialist countries themselves, Biden will lose. There's no question. I mean, Biden will lose because the impact of this is on his base is huge. I mean, people are already saying they're not going to vote for him. Significant numbers of people saying that. You've got enormous numbers of people involved in demonstrations and organising and so on in the US, and they're trying huge methods of repression, blacklisting, efforts to numbers of people being sacked, McCarthyite methods are being used. You're seeing the same, of course, in Germany, in which, I mean, people are not, actually, there's considerable, opposition. There's a large Palestinian and Jewish community, which is the anti-Zionist Jewish community in places like Berlin, but you can't actually appear on the street with a keffiyeh or a Palestinian flag without the threat of arrest. there's been real effort to try and repress this movement. In this country, obviously, they would like to repress the movement. They do label it hate and all the rest of it, but they haven't been able to do it. And we've seen there's a continuous thing. I mean, here in Glasgow, basically we run a weekly demonstration every week. And use them as a people, and it's been really interesting to because you get to talk to all sorts of people from all sorts of places, and you see, I mean, people will say, look, who come from various of the Arab countries are just saying that we're ashamed because the Houthis are only people who are resisting these characters. They're resisting the Zionists. All the other Arab regimes are sitting there watching it, and there's nothing happening. I mean, you've got a near uprising in Jordan. I mean, if they were offered, I'm pretty sure half the population of Jordan would march to the border armed in an effort to take on the Israelis.
I think I'm going to have to stop you there.
The whole thing's going crazy. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
I mean, just to chair myself in for a second. First of all, there's a comment that Claire Dovers put up, which says the International Court of Justice report back on the genocide charge is due in early February. And Claire says, I think that whatever the decision, which I hope is in favour of the Palestinians, this will determine the next stage for the countries and the military strategies tied up also in the year of the US elections. It does, I mean, I think for me anyway, Yemen does, and the developments around it, and the US and UK military involvement and other nations' involvement in it is but one of a series of events across the globe where you can feel kind of the global order tearing, really, and you can see a huge level of instability, I think. I mean, occasionally one now sees reports about Ukraine on the news. Yeah. Off the agenda is a civil war in Sudan. In Africa's largest country, there is a massive civil war going on there, over which it doesn't appear to me any of the imperialist powers, certain level of control, but it's a huge civil war in the heart of Africa. Across West Africa, you've got battles going across many countries between Islamist and militias and governments, backed by different sides. If you look at the United States, I mean, it feels fantastically tense. The stepping back of DeSantis took me by surprise, I have to say, so early, and Trump is kind of triumphant. And every time I've been reading a book about Britain before the Second World War, and people talked about a Chamberlain looking grey. Every time I look at Biden, he looks greyer. He's kind of representative of a section of the ruling class that are about to be politically smashed, I think. And we don't really know what's going to come out of that. But kind of the impact closer to home is going to be, I mean, we're talking about Biden's chances, yeah, and losing the election, which I think he is pretty now sure to do. In Wes Streeting's constituency, there is now a community candidate against Wes Streeting, and the primary basis of it is Palestine. And I think there are going to be other candidates who come forward like that to challenge Labour in areas where this is a key issue. And it poses a really big question for the Labour Party and for Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party and what it means in terms of Labour's vote. They are the war party. They're as much a war party as the Tory party. That's the point. And people see it. It can be seen. And whether this has the same effect of demobilising Labour's vote, I think we've yet to see. But just to return to my first point, is you can feel the world system of alliances creaking and tearing, and there's a lot going wrong right now, and there's a lot of tension right now. I'll stop there and I will bring Minnie in.
Sorry, Will, did you say Minnie? I'm not sure.
I did. Yes, I did. Okay. Sorry, I was speaking.
No, thanks. Yeah, yeah, I think we've been attacking Yemen. I heard someone say the other day since the 1800s. Long time. And capitalism, basically, what is it but a turf war? I heard someone on the left, not just before actually, calling Netanyahu smart because he's been in power for so long and he can work the Americans. He knows what to do. but he's a thug. That's what he is. He's a thug. Yeah. Something about the US. There's a weekly demonstration in Liverpool as well now, Matthew. Yeah. The US. It was either Blinken or the US president because to get funding for, I think it was either for Gaza or for Yemen. I think it might have been for the Israelis, you know, to bomb Gaza. They had to sign, and they bypassed Congress. They had to sign, whoever it was, Blinken or Biden, an emergency to say it was an emergency, and they also had to say it was, you know, the US was being threatened. Really, the US was at risk, basically. And I heard one US lawyer saying, basically, that's illegal what they've done. They've lied to get that. Let's see. Yeah, so I finished off last time saying, well, we're not free until we're all free. Obviously, the realization that colonial capitalism, it's just they've colonized us at home, haven't they? I keep saying this. They colonize everyone. And it's driven by othering, whole communities, countries, creeds. So, you know, Muslims are murderous, rapists. You know, the Houthis are poor brown people, not to be cared about. And capitalism holds so many weapons. It makes so many weapons. Am I done?
No, you got a minute.
Already, I can't believe it. These stocks of depleted uranium cells. Have I finished? Was that
You've
three?
got a minute. You've got a minute, Minnie.
All right, right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and Matthew was saying something about the authoritarianism and not wearing it. You'd be arrested in some countries. Well, there was a woman, I think she was a pensioner. I don't know whether it was Norfolk. The police raided her house in the early morning and arrested her for basically attaching a poster to a Tory MP's door because she'd been trying to contact this MP for weeks about Gaza and what's going on, the need for peace. And she used drawing pins, and they were arresting her for criminal damage. And they only de-arrested her when she agreed to come in. It's on Twitter. There's footages there. And apparently, according to Tony Greenstein, the Met Police are now banning certain books, probably ones about, you know, that they would call anti-Semitic, perhaps, which wouldn't be anti-Semitic, just anti-colonial. Yeah. There's some good news. Sky News actually interviewed the young Israeli guy who's refusing to serve in the military. Now, that was on Sky News today. He was allowed to say he wants peace, that they all need to come together. And he said, we're not free until we're all free either. So that is very, very good.
Well, on that good news, Minnie, I'm going to have to stop you because you've had 3 minutes now.
Okay.
All right. Other hands up, please. Who else would like to make a contribution? Nick.
Yes. So
Yeah,
the question that Chris has posed and the discussion raises is how do we confront what's happening? Because it's quite clear, as many of the contributions have pointed out, we're getting into a more and more unstable world. The ruling class cannot defend even the limited democracy that has been gained through struggle in the past, and their system is coming apart at the seams. The more that happens, the more unstable it becomes, the more the ruling class will be tempted to prosecute wars in order to try to resolve the questions that they face. And that primary question is going to be, how do they maintain or potentially increase their profit, which means how do they extend their domination? That means we are heading, I'm not saying immediately, but we are heading inexorably over a period of time to a confrontation with China, which will involve all the countries of the world who will take sides, you know, to see where they think their bread is better buttered. The thing that's lacking is the independent involvement or intrusion onto the arena of history of the working class. because it's only the working class that can stop this. Many left-wingers, if you look at what's being read or posted on Facebook or Twitter and so on, it seems that it's limited to calling on this or that government or this or that body to apply a ceasefire, and somehow that will resolve the matter, or that countries who oppose America should be backed simply because they're opposing America. But of course, the conflict is going to, whoever wins, whoever comes out on top, it's still going to be capitalist exploitation, working class people exploited for profit. The protests, the demonstrations, the resistance, yes, they're absolutely fantastic, but they need to be channeled to a particular end, in my opinion. And that is not just to stop war, but to end the system that produces the war, and that is the profit system. And that means, as Chris said, we need mass communist socialist parties who challenge the system and want to end it. And without that, we're simply going to see history repeat itself worse and worse and worse.
Okay, I'm going to give, thanks very much for that, Nick. I'm going to give Chris some time for kind of a half-time comeback, or probably two-thirds time comeback. Chris, over to you.
I'll try and be briefer than Roy Hodgson. So Minnie's right. We're not free until we're all free. Absolutely right. Many comments that I agree with. Matthew's absolutely right on the crisis, a deep crisis within Israeli society. Really shaking the foundations of that state. And in effect, the war has saved Netanyahu and his hangers-on, who probably have been shuffled out months ago. But it's likely that they will soon be out of government. Anyway, I think one interesting thing to consider is how the Israeli state has slipped the reins of the United States.
Mm.
That is interesting in and of itself, that all of the arms, the British and American special forces and advisor is currently in Israel. I know sometimes Socialist Workers' Party get pretty bad rap, rightly so in many cases, but they were given a D notice to not report on British special forces being deployed to Israel in support of the campaign on Gaza. And to the credit, the editors of Socialist Worker rejected that D notice and published what is actually happening. The British state is militarily involved in what is taking place in Gaza. And that is why Matthew is right. The protests in Cyprus are extremely important. On Joe Biden and the United States, I mean, the first function of the world hegemon, that is currently United States, was previously Britain, is to ensure unhindered shipping, to ensure that trade is not intercepted, and to make sure that the normal workings of capitalism as they see it are not affected by oppressed peoples or the actions of the working class anywhere in the world. One of the first adventures of the new American Republic in 1802 was to go to war against the Barbary states, against the slavers in Tripoli and what have you, in defense of their ships and in defense of the shipping lanes that their economy relied so much on. Jane asks, why? Whose interests in terms of the slip towards war? Who's that in? Of course, most capitalists will avoid the destruction of their own capital, whether it's invested in of estates or in ships and property and what have you. That's why the oil infrastructure in the Arabian Peninsula and in parts of Iraq and Syria are defended by the United States. Ed mentioned there's a quiet majority in the coalition of the willing. But, you know, we know who these people are essentially, don't we? They are, you know, the corrupt and dictatorial states in East Africa. It's the Jordanians, you know, it's the Saudis and the, you know, Gulf Cooperation Council states who, you know, want a fear of upsetting their own populations, you know, stay quiet, but are, all intents and purposes, are tucked right underneath the wing of the United States. But what is driving the attacks on the Yemeni people and on the Houthis and the wider region is the safeguarding of profits. And there's a gamble there. There's a gamble there by the ruling class in Washington and in London and what have you, that they can silence the missiles and the commando raids of the Houthis and whoever. That gamble clearly isn't paying off and clearly won't pay off. Because what is going to happen is slowly but surely Iran is going to be dragged into further confrontation with the West. I'm going to finish there. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was about four minutes or so. I mean, the next speaker, I think I'm going to call Ed in because Ed's only spoken once. So Ed.
Yeah, so I think what I wanted to talk about, Chris and Nick have both raised the need for an alternative and the need for a working class alternative that's armed with the ideas that can argue against and campaign against and fight the drive to war. And I think that it raises a crucial challenge for us as well, because of course the forces of the organized working class pretty weak in this country, even weaker, of course, in Palestine, in Yemen, both countries which barely have a functioning economy and have been devastated by war, and much less functioning labor movement or a political voice of the working class. But in this country, I think it's incumbent on us to start developing the arguments against war, because, of course, one of the key ways in which the situation can be changed is by political change in the countries which are currently prosecuting this war, of which our country is playing a leading role. And so I think it's incumbent on us to start developing and to start writing articles and producing materials to explain to people why this war is happening, in whose interests the war is being fought, why the official narrative shouldn't be trusted, and why this war and other wars are an inescapable consequence of the system that we live in. And so I think that is a key task that we, as a small group of communists who understand all of those things, or have the beginnings of an understanding of all those things, something that we can actually work on, even in very small steps and at a very early stage. And so I think that articles on our website, more discussions like this one, and things of that kind are something really important that we can contribute to.
Thanks very much, Ed. Matthew.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing that people have sort of started to have mentioned and is critical, actually, of course, is the position of the unions. I mean, the Palestinian unions themselves actually appealed for support on, I think, the 16th of October. And they got support. I mean, there were actually, there were a number of unions actually said they would support and have said, well, we won't handle arms. The Belgian unions, various sort of, I think one of the Italian unions, the Barcelona Dockers, there's a number of people, and it's even been it's a live debate within the US unions, and there's steadily more support for the Palestinians among US trade unions. And it's even sort of penetrating into the AFL-CIO. British unions, of course, are rather peculiar because actually most of them formally have decent positions on Palestine because the membership passed these at conferences. So if you look at even the likes of the GMB, which of course is pretty right wing, actually has quite a decent position. Unison again, I mean, for pretty right wing, but has a decent position on Palestine. Even Unite, again, the problem is the union bureaucracy, of course, has no interest at all in doing anything about it, and has managed to stymie these things. And so, therefore, British workers are still manufacturing weapons, and those weapons are being moved to Israel. And there's been no movement at all by any of the unions to actually prevent any of this from happening. So you get a situation in which actually the work to prevent weapons being manufactured is being done by things like Palestine Action. And there's been virtually no debate in terms of the unions, because the unions say, well, we're still getting Jews out of people who are making weapons, so we don't care. Particularly Unite, of course. Unite have tried to prevent their own members from taking banners on demonstrations. Despite the fact that formally the union has a position in support of the Palestinians. Has tried to prevent people from discussing Palestine on their own bloody premises, the bastards. This is Sharon Games' position, and it's a scandal. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, that Palestine Action can carry out this massive campaign, shut down factories, cause all kinds of damage, and then go to court. And of course, the juries, of course, agree with them. And the government's got this desperate position; they can't get convictions against them, which is hilariously funny. But it does demonstrate, the appalling nature of the labour movement in this country.
Hey, Nick.
Well, just following on from Matthew's point there, it's been raised, quite frequently in some of the discussions that we've organised in the past, the despicable and disgraceful role of the GMB union, particularly in calling for an increase in spending on arms by the government. And if you remember 2 years ago at the TUC Congress, that motion was passed with the support of Unite, ostensibly a left-wing union. You then last week had the speech by Shapps, the defense secretary, defense minister, who's able to go public with announcing all the increase in spending on arms, knowing that he's got the full backing of the British trade union movement. And what it shows is that we need a complete revolution inside the trade unions to get rid of the rotten, corrupt bureaucracy that put trade union members' jobs before the lives of the people in the Yemen or Gaza or elsewhere, and refuse to argue that instead of producing arms, we should be producing socially useful things. It's an obvious point that any trade unionist, any working class person, any socialist particularly, would support. So that's a big job of work, taking up Ed's point, a big job of work. But I think we can make real headway on that. We want useful things, not machines to kill. It's an old socialist position, and one that we need to return to. The other thing that we need to think about, in my opinion, is the question of the way in which the Stop the War coalition organises and presents its arguments, because it does appear to me that it's very, very limited. It's essentially calling on the United Nations or governments to organise a ceasefire, which is, I'm in favour of calling for a ceasefire, but they never really go beyond that. They don't criticise, they protect really those so-called left-wing Labour MPs that withdrew their names from the Stop the War coalition statement on Ukraine, who haven't said a peep about Gaza. That's not all of them, but most of them. And we need a Stop the War campaign that points out the connection, the inevitable, inextricable connection between capitalism and war. And the idea that you can stop war without ending capitalism is a nonsense, and that needs to be pointed out. I don't have time to answer Janet's excellent question about the situation in Israel, but I'd just say this, if I may. It's absolutely essential for us to realize that no matter the country, and that includes Israel, class war takes place permanently. It may be glossed over or hidden, but there are huge numbers of poor people in Israel, and the protests against the attacks on democracy, I think, augured the potential for socialists to make headway, in contradiction to other people who simply write off the Israeli working class as all being behind Netanyahu. They're not.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Nick. I mean, I'm just going to pick up very briefly on my own behalf on the question of the trade unions and war and alternatives. Those who've been around for quite a long time may well remember the Lucas aerospace plan that was put forward to kind of convert military industry to civil production. Now there was a good thing about that and a bad thing about it. The good thing was that people were raising the issue that instead of producing stuff for war, we should be producing something that's socially useful. That was a good thing. The bad thing about it was that it actually, not sure it would have worked, and actually it was kind of quite weak arguments for what you could produce from a military factory, and it didn't really have it became an argument that the peace movement leaned on in order to try and make the point, rather than exploring properly what it would mean to have a conversion from a military economy to a civil economy. And the thing that we have to realize is that the point about the British military economy, right, is that it is precisely about its capacity to defend British capital's interests across the globe. It's not about jobs. It's absolutely not about jobs, because all of these jobs are subsidized by, I mean, the last time I looked, it's about £20,000 a year per job is subsidizing in military industry. So it's actually there for a very, very strategic reason. Yeah, and it's not about, I mean, of course, arms companies make money, workers have jobs, but the real purpose is to have a warm military mobilization base so Britain can defend its interests. So I think we are in a position now where we could, 40 years later, where communists and socialists can make a serious argument about how you can convert many of these industries really quickly from military to civil production. And one of the reasons for this is that, of course, the ruling class has been really interested to see how you can do it the other way, from civil to military. And there's lots of work gone on over the last 30 years, particularly by a guy called Ed Gansler, that shows you can switch this stuff backwards and forwards if you have the will to do it. Yeah. So it's not an impossibility to talk to workers in this industries about the brilliant skills many of them have and how they could be deployed on producing useful stuff that is very technologically advanced and goes way beyond basically the bus on wheels that came out of Lucas Aerospace. So that is an argument that we need to be having, particularly in the Unite and the GMB, because it's a winnable argument. It felt like it wasn't winnable at one point, but it's a winnable argument now. We should be focused on that. I too feel uncomfortable about the two campaigns that are ongoing. There's the Stop the War campaign, which I think has its limitations. I can understand why a united front is being built around ceasefire, but actually we should be calling for the Israelis to get out of the West Bank, really. And if the Palestinians want to fight to kick the Israelis out, then we need to think about what the ceasefire slogan means in that context. And of course, on the other side, we've got no to NATO, which is part of the politics of the bloc. We're on the side of China and Russia because it's against the United States, and I'm not very convinced about that approach either. I'll shut up there, and I'll bring Minnie back in.
Try and be me. Right, okay. Yeah, BAE Systems are sitting in Canal doing work. And Canal is doing work on submarines for the military. Canal is a company on Birkenhead on Merseyside. I agree with you, Nick. We need to we can't stop war without stopping capitalism. I think the Lucas plan was so positive in so many ways. They saw the future. They saw the green, that we needed, well, heat pumps. We needed what you said, Will, electric buses, etc. And the working class came up with those ideas. The engineers, the people who designed things, fantastic. And obviously didn't get enough publicity or anything, so couldn't get its message out really. And it would have been sitting within capitalism, wouldn't it? So also, in Israel, there was something on the news last night about there are protesters camped outside Netanyahu's house. And also they did show a demo the other day. It was on Al Jazeera for pro-Palestinian, to stop fighting, and it wasn't just about the hostages, because they're up in arms, quite rightly so. But so there were a few hundred people there, and that was in Tel Aviv. Then there's also and these colonels are talking about, well, if they're going to go to war, what are they going to use? Because they've got an aircraft carrier off Japan, which has to be there apparently for Japan. They've got 2 aircraft carriers deployed. They've only got, is it another 6 or something, and they're out of action or they're somewhere else. What are they going to use? There aren't many troops. The UK army, a third of our army's gone in austerity. It's crazy. I know a lot of it will be cyber war, but it's crazy. So is it going to be nuclear war? Is this it? We really have to stop this. If they haven't got the army, the boots on the ground, then it's going to be nuclear war, isn't it? I'll end it on that. But after saying nuclear war, I'm going to say we're not free till we're all free.
Thanks, Minnie. I think the US has been thinking for some time about how to fight painless wars, and I think they've worked out it's get other people to fight them for you, which is what we see in Ukraine and Israel, actually. But Chris, over to you to kind of wrap up the conversation we've been having.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, comrades, for your comments and for everything that you've said this evening. It's a tall order to try and wrap that up, but I will do my best. I think what is colouring the entire period is as Will said earlier, the decline of the United States as the world hegemon. I think small powers, larger powers, all challenging that order in numerous ways, which is seeing parts of the globe fall into conflict. The wars that we once fought at the periphery of the capitalist centre or far away in Iraq or wherever, now on our doorstep when it comes to Ukraine or the Eastern Mediterranean. In the Pacific, obviously, we see a growing confrontation between the United States and China. Whose interest are these wars being fought in? Paul Mason and Jacob Rees-Mogg and that lot will tell you that currently British action in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, is in defence of sailors and me and you going to buy our groceries. Of course, that's a lie. The interest is in capitalism, is in profits, is in the defence of the hegemonic bloc led by the United States. Claire asked about the ICJ, and what would Trump do? Well, he says that he's going to end all wars, all forever wars and what have you, except the growing drums of war in the Pacific. We'll see, I think, whether that turns out to be true. I suspect the US military and the military-industrial complex will have a lot to say about Trump trying to pull back from conflict in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. There is no solution in the Levant, in the Middle East, without the working class. Comrades are absolutely right. The calls for ceasefire is the call for the status quo or return to the status quo. Now that serves people like Erdogan, that serves the Hashemite Kingdom in Jordan, that serves the Saudis, all of those dictators, because the people, the Palestinian Arabs will be stuck in Gaza in an open-air prison, reduced to rubble. Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank will be slowly but surely ethnically cleansed from their homes and their lands, and things can go on as before and the likes of Erdogan and what have you will have a nice mobilizing, constant wound, which they can mobilize their supporters primarily against the working class or any working class demands. Because we can see living standards falling across the region. We can see outbreaks of violence, and what have you. Matthew and other comrades have spoken about democracy and the attacks on the movements. Absolutely right. I mean, what we have seen since the mass protests have started against the genocidal war in Gaza, has been shocking. Hate marches for people turning up, calling for peace, calling for, aid and what have you, been whipped up into a frenzy across the media, but hasn't had the effect that the British ruling class wanted it to. Because people are, as comrades have said, the majority of people in Britain are well aware that what is happening to the people of Gaza is unacceptable, and they want that to end. The accusations of anti-Semitism, the arrests of socialists, so the arrest of Socialist Appeal comrades, for example, for supporting a mass movement against the Israeli occupation, the vilification of Muslims, all kind of reminds me of the atmosphere that we were in 2003, and many comrades will remember that, and it does feel that we're back there again. Interested in the comments on the trade unions. And let's be clear, I mean, the union leaders in the Labour Party will go on telly and into the papers and what have you and cry tears at any mention that arms manufacturers may be closed down or there'll be a loss of jobs in the Clyde or in Cumbria or what have you. But let's be clear, it is young trade unionists, young workers who will be going off to fight these wars. It'll be those who will be, the working class will have its blood spent by a ruling class that is crying over arms manufacturers and what have you. So it's not just that we need to change, the workshops producing arms from, missiles and what have you towards something socially useful or even things that are just fun. What we need is a total transformation of society. Arms into plowshares, but there can be no truck with the British state. The officer caste has to go. The standing army has to go. The security apparatus has to go. Those long-coated thugs in GCHQ and in the security services all have to go. And everything that they've been up to needs to be open and made public to all of us. Nick and other comrades have said that there is no stopping war without ending capitalism. They're absolutely right. Capitalism is at the kernel, is the wellspring of these wars, as different capitalist blocs battle it out for resources, for markets, for spheres of influence and the rest. And it's only by building up the forces of the working class, only by raising the working class up to that of a ruling class, armed with a communist program, armed with the ideas that we've discussed today about abolishing the military, about transforming the way production is, guided towards need, not profit, and not towards war. And that should be our goal in terms of what we do in the coming period, is to strengthen those forces, strengthen and support those comrades who are trying to blockade ports, who rightly see that ceasefires and what have you, the status quo is not an acceptable world to live in. That is what we should be turning our arms towards. I will end just simply on I will end on what Mooney said, actually. We are not free until we're all free. And comrades, we need to start building up our forces and building up our party that can begin to pose a serious challenge and begin to start building the forces to bring about freedom, not just here, but across the world. Thank you, Will.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for that, and thanks for your introduction as well as your conclusions. Really interesting. Thanks to everybody who has participated this evening, has made comments and asked questions and contributed to the discussion. Just to remind you that we have a bulletin, and sign up for the bulletin. If you're not signed up to it, go to the Talking About Socialism website, sign up there. And to remind you again of our next meeting, which is on the 5th of February, how has the broad left project of De Linke fared in Germany? From Syriza in Greece to Podemos in Spain, broad left parties have been a failed model for leftists internationally. What lessons can we learn? Ed Potts will be introducing that one, and given what looks to me to be the very dynamic situation in Germany at the moment, it's sure to be a very interesting discussion. Okay, well, great to see everybody. See you at the next one. Visit the website, make comments, and offer us articles. Good to see you all again. Okay, bye-bye.